Hey everyone, welcome to tonight's presentation. I am Master Remy de la Montagne de Gascon in the East Kingdom of the SCA. In tonight's presentation, I'm going to talk about the 16th and 17th century French fencing and dueling culture. So we're going to be looking at the formation of the Parisian Fencing Guild. We'll look a little bit at the fencing masters in the books they publish, but only real quick because there are some other great presentations that have come out recently that cover that. So I'll have links for people that want to keep diving down that rabbit hole. We'll look at what life was like in a French fencing cell, so fencing school. We'll look at how someone became a fencing master, kind of like the path they had to take. And we'll also look at the French dueling culture, like a quick overview of how often did they fight, why did they fight, where they fought, and all that kind of stuff to kind of see if the French kind of actually lived up to the reputation of just liking to stab each other with swords and stuff all the time. So let me get my presentation up, and then we will get going. If anyone has any questions, you can totally put it in the chat. I will have the chat in my other window here. All right, let me screen share. Awesome. Can everyone see my screen here just fine?
Yes.
Awesome. So the master players, an overview of French fencing culture during the 16th and 17th century. And just for a little bit of reference, I did a quick version of this last summer for Warder Raphael of the mid-round. He had like a little 10, 15-minute Marshall A&S presentation event. So I basically did a speed run through this. So this is a slower version of that, and with extra stuff that I didn't have in the original presentation and stuff. So even if this seems a little bit familiar, there'll be some new stuff, especially at the end. So a little bit about the Corporation of Masters. So this was the Parisian Fencing Guild. So before the mid 1500s, the Paris fencing masters really kind of were isolated. They all were doing their own thing. They didn't really have a union or a guild, as it were. But they decided to kind of band together, and they petitioned Charles IX to let them kind of create a corporation of a masters and deeds and master of arms in Paris. Charles IX was like, cool, gave him a letters patent to do so, and they kind of like started up their little guild. And the guild lasted from this 1567 till 1791, when the Revolutionary War Council kind of kiboshed it and stuff. And it did come back afterwards, but not quite to the same level of austere that it had originally. In this image right here, this is basically the device that Louis XIV gave the company in 1656, and one of the French fencing schools in Paris still uses this symbol. They kind of basically just readopted it, which is kind of cool. So you'll still see the symbol a little bit and around. So the key objective for the Corporation of Masters was really to regulate who was allowed to teach fencing in Paris. So really it was basically all about protecting their business and protecting their income. People that were teaching fencing that weren't basically part of the guild were called ferrailleurs or duelists or iron rattlers. I've seen like a few different like interpretations of that word, but basically you were unrecognized fencing teacher. So you were off, you weren't part of the guild, you were kind of doing this illegally, and the guild would sue you to get you shut down pretty regularly and stuff. These kind of rules, the guild would especially created rules to kind of target the Italians, because the Italian fencing and Italian culture was pretty big in France during the Renaissance. And the French fencing masters really kind of wanted to protect their own income. And even though a lot of these Italian masters weren't recognized by their like guilds, it was very easy for these Italian masters to kind of like get dispensations from the cane or some other high royal born and stuff anyways. So like, and this is kind of the reason why right here is the royal fencing masters from Charles IX up through kind of Louis XIV were all Italian. So even though like we had this Paris guild that was sanctioned by the king, the king and his family were mostly going to Italian. So you had Pompey teaching to Charles IX. You had Sylvie teaching Henry III. You had Hieronymo Calacabo teaching Henry IV. Then his son Caesar taught Louis XIII. So we had a little bit of a family dynasty for a couple of reigns. And then by the time we had Louis XIV, we have this fellow named Vincent Francois de Saint-Onge, who was born in Naples, but he was naturalized in France in 1617. So he's like, I'll give that one. I'll give that one to the French. We'll give the French half a point there, in terms of like finally make it into the top tier of French fencing masters, and at least in influence and stuff like that. And a lot of this is that the Italians, like the French, a lot of the French, they would send their kids out to Italy to learn how to fence, or they would import Italian masters into France to teach their kids. So a lot of the French, actually the French school and the French fencing style is very rooted in Italian. So like a lot of we'll look at some of the French fencing master books in a second. A lot of them are kind of like rooted very similar to like Balinese style. And then some of the later fencing masters were still very similar to like what you would see in Gigante or Caprofaro and stuff like that. It's very Italian influence. They just kind of use French words and stuff like that. It's not until really the 1640s that, as like the small sword became kind of was born and became more of a thing through the later half of the 17th century, did the French really kind of come into their own and became like really dominated like the fencing culture in a lot of Europe. So we're going to look at some French fencing manuals. There's not a lot in the 16th through mid 17th century. There's just not a lot. One of the sources that I have basically said that the French just didn't really care about the written word. I'm not sure how true that is or not, but we just don't have a lot of French books to begin with. And there's not a lot of pictures and stuff as well. So, but we do have some books. So we have Henry Saint Didier. His book came out in 1573. It's very cut and thrust Balinese style, just to kind of give people like, I don't want to call it Balinese, but just to kind of give people an idea of how movement in the blade kind of works and stuff. He really focused on the single sword. Then we had Captain Péloquin, also kind of cut and thrust. This is the image of what his plates look like, and we're going to look in this in a second because it's really probably the most unique and really cool fencing illustrations you're going to ever run into. And there's not a lot's not known about Péloquin to really know if he was a master someplace, not in Paris. He hasn't come up in the Parisian records, but it could have been a master in another city, or was he just a captain who happened to write a fencing book? We don't really know, but his illustration is really cool. Then we have Andre Desbordes. He's writing similar to Palladini. Some people think he just basically rewrote Palladini in French. Palladini is kind of like, it's similar to like Agrippa. It's like an early rapier. So the stance is a little bit more upright and not kind of like that like lean back, lower stance that you kind of see with like Caprofaro and Gigante, but it's not quite like the side sword Balinese style either. So we're kind of transition a little bit more forward. What I like about Andre Desbordes, just a fun little bio about him. He got mixed up in some politics, and when his patron died, people decided to take their frustrations out on him, and he was tried for witchcraft. And the evidence that they brought up was that he was so nimble that he had to have been in league with the devil, which I think is probably like the coolest compliment you can ever get. So, you know, I think as fencers or people interested in fencing, if someone ever says that you must be in league with the devil because you're just so nimble with the blade, I feel like that's a pretty good compliment. I think that's something I want to strive for. Then we have Francois d'Ancy in 1617. No illustrations in his book. He writes about rapier and dagger. Andre Desbordes is mostly single rapier, but also a little bit of dagger at the end. And then we have Charles Besnard in 1653. He's single rapier, and his book is very recognizable as like rapier, as we would kind of think about it in terms of like a very Italian style. And I really like how his book is set up. It's very much, I'll talk more about this next week for Keelan's Generals Chat. Because people are going to be talking about different masters they like to read and everything. But basically, his kind of breaks things out by like, you've engaged your opponent on the inside line. They're most likely to do these 4 things. And if they do option A, here are 6 ways you can defeat them. If they do option B, here's 3. So it's very kind of flow charty. which I think it's good for. I think might be a good entry level book in terms of reading and being able to like create drills and get ideas from it and stuff. But let's go look at Peliquin's illustration. I got this off a Photoshop off Wiktenhow, which I think is really cool. So what's cool about Peliquin's illustration, it tells you the target of your opponent, which is in this Photoshop illustration here, is the red. So you have the eyes, the heart, that is the navel, the stomach, and then the groin. And then it also shows you where your sword or sword and dagger begin. And there'll be lines where like it shows the path. So it will show you the direction of the cut. And then it also shows foot placement and how the feet move during a particular play. And these lines show not only just the height that you're aiming at your opponent and also the height of where your weapons are, but it also shows you how far you're stepping. So there's a lot of info that gets dumped into one like pencil drawing or however it's done. It looks very alien. It's kind of crazy, but I really like what whoever made this for Wiktenauer basically kind of broke it up into three illustrations and then kind of put it on three different axes, as it were, and then kind of compared it to illustrations that we see in Saint Didier and stuff. So anyone looking to do some cool A&S projects, I think this would be a really cool start. But anyways, Captain Peliquin, really cool just to kind of look at. Some common themes in the French fencing manuals that you kind of run into. One, like I just said, there's very few books. There's like pretty much that's it you'll find from like the mid 16th through mid 17th century. There's not a lot of plates or images. Like Saint Didier has a bunch of illustrations. He's really kind of the exception until we get to the small sword. Charles Besnard just has three. He's got this one that I have here on the screen, a stance, and then basically a void. That's all he has. We see poetry in a lot of the French books. Either poetry kind of lavishing whoever the person, the master trying to, whoever's good graces they're trying to win. Sometimes the poems about how awesome the master is. So you get a little bit of poetry PR before you get to the actual meat of the book about just how cool this fencing master is. There's a lot of debate between heart versus skill in some of the books. So basically, do you need to practice? And this amused me when I read that, because this is kind of also a debate that we still see even nowadays in the SCA and HEMA. It's like, how much does drilling matter? Can you just get really good or get better by practicing, or like just by sparring? I mean, and because some people who drill really well and practice all the time still die in duels. And we see that in SCA and HEMA. You can drill a lot, but you still might not win a lot in tournaments. And they kind of talk about the reason why and the balance between heart versus skill, which I think is kind of cool. For the most part, I was just kind of mentioned as well, the manual's really focused on one weapon. You don't really see, well, we're going to start with single, rapier, and then dagger, and then maybe cloak like you do with like the Italians. They really just kind of hyper-focused on one form. And the French really love this single rapier. So that seems to be, or the single swords, that really kind of dominates a lot of their fencing culture through the 16th century through, all the way through like the 19th century and stuff like that. And again, the fencing is very rooted in Italian, between the Italians being imported and French noble kids being exported to Italy to kind of learn. A lot of the words or the phrases are basically just the French versions of Italian. So we have like seconda and quart, just like secunda or quarta in Italian. So there's a lot of crossover and stuff. So if you're, in terms of SCA persona, if you are a Frenchman in the SCA and you're like, I want to fence like a Frenchman, you can basically just fence Italian, and that's pretty close. You can go to one of these other French fencing masters if you really kind of want to dive down that deep into the well. But you can I think you can easily get away with saying I'm fighting insert Italian master name and stuff like that. All right, so we're going to now look into the French fencing salon, and this is all according to Pastor Etienne Benet. He wrote this under the pseudonym René Francois in 1622. So he kind of gives us a little bit of an inside look of what it would be like to be in a French fencing school. So the first off is the weapon, the foil. So it's not the foil like we think of as today, where like the modern Olympic fencing, where it's like a small dish and a very short floppy blade. The foil back then was basically, it was the sword that they would have used. So it would have been a rapier, but it just would have been a foiled end and there would be no edge on the blade. So at least some of these foils, the blades are very thick, even thicker than what we really use for in the SAE and HEMA. But like this is like the image right here. This is an example of a fencing foil. So it looks, you got basically a swept tilt rapier there. You can kind of see this little pyramid button at the end. They would still put leather at the end of the button, just kind of like we have rubber tips, or we also, some of us will use leather at the end of our practice rapiers. They did that back then, so it's kind of funny to see how close our fencing culture can actually be in. And if you notice that they didn't have some kind of padding at the end of their foil, you would say put an end on the foil. And here's a close-up of what that looks like. So you can see how thick that blade is and the pyramid point. And this is a chonker of a foil. This one weighs 4.2 pounds. So this one is from Leeds. So 4.2 pounds, that's a heavy rapier. A lot of the rapiers we use are kind of between like 2 and 3 pounds. This is thick, and I think it's really because of that thicker blade. I think this might have been like, I haven't really compared this to a bunch of other period fencing foils to know if this weight was the norm or if this was just happened to be an outlier. But I think it has to do with it being a very thick blade, and it's, maybe over time that blade kind of thinned down or something to kind of fix a little bit of the weight. But like you can even see the blade length, 46 inches. So that's even long, even by our SCA standards. Overall length, 52 inches. And this one came out of Italy. So I think it's pretty reasonable to think that a Frenchman would use something similar to this. All right, so some customs in the Salle. In the French Salle, one gives or receives strikes, one does not make strikes, and one does not kill. What I thought, well, this is pretty cool because I've had some conversations previously with folks about how like they don't like the idea of saying I killed you or I killed my opponent in the SCA and stuff. It's just too violent for them, which I think is perfectly legit. So if you're kind of looking for some other ways of describing your passes with somebody, here are some period examples. You can say I gave you a good hit, I received a good hit. That works perfectly good. If you want to free fence with someone or get in a bout, you ask them do you want to make it an assault, which I think is kind of poetically violent, the way at least that's kind of translated and stuff. Messieurs, protect your eyes. The French had no face shots. This was before fencing masks were a thing. So they just tried to avoid the face at all costs. Obviously, mistakes happen, and you're probably going to hit someone in the face at some point, especially, as we all know, when people kind of both dive in at the same time. So at that point, you put your weapon down, you check in on your friend, because even back then, your sparring partner is probably a friend or at least an acquaintance. It's not an actual duel. The passes were strictly thrust only. The quote that's in there was, we do not use at this time cuts, for cutting strikes are the knocked and true strikes of the Swiss and Germans, which I can't tell if this was just like a friendly little jab at the Swiss and Germans, or if this is a little bit of jingoism kind of seeping through into the fencing culture. But either way, I think this thrust-centric fencing culture is what would lead to the French really adopting the small sword. I guess the weapons would change from this rapier, which was still primarily thrust, but you could still do a good amount of cutting with it. If all you're doing is thrust, you can kind of change the weapon into something that's more optimized for that, which is going to be lighter. You don't need to worry about as big of hand protection and stuff like that. And there's some videos that's out there that people are kind of going into the transition of the weapon forms in France, and I'll link to that at the end of the source, and I'll share the link to these slides so people can kind of track down those presentations, because it's really cool. All right, the rule of the fencing master. Fencing masters rarely fought. The provost was the highest ranking member of the school that would actually fight other students. The master's role was obviously to teach, instruct. Again, the techniques were rooted in the Italian system. They would stop fights if things got heated, so they kind of played a little bit of a marshal or MIC kind of role, as it were, and they would mark the faults and judge strikes. So they basically were also playing the fencing judge. So they kind of had multiple hats that they would kind of play. And this is, again, from one of my sources saying the French public put little value in fencing manuals, which is why there are so few read until late in the 17th century. Again, I'm not sure how true that is. I feel like I would need to go outside just the French fencing culture to the wider French culture to figure out, do the French actually care about books or not? but I thought that was kind of interesting. In case anyone has insight to that, I threw that in there because I might be able to learn something during this presentation as well. And here's another slide from Besnard, the way he breaks up his the divisions of his sword, very Italian-esque. So you got the true and the false, and then you got the weak and the strong. He just used French words instead of Italian. All right, so the cell had their own code of conduct. Again, this is another big thing that a lot of HEMA schools and SCA practices have been talking about, creating behaviors of code of conduct. So in case anyone breaks them, there's at least some guidance for how they can handle problem children, as it were. And we can kind of, these aren't all the rules, but you can kind of, these are like three main three categories. So the first one's on politeness. It's about saluting the master and fellow students. No blasphemy, no teasing or dirty stories, burping or farting. And what I like about this is just like every SCA rule has a name attached to it, I feel like every one of these rules also has a name or a story attached to it. And I don't know what those are, but I'm sure we all can fill in those blanks and stuff. No spinning in the hand while fencing. I'm not sure if that's to just get a better grip, just kind of like that very cartoony, spit, rub the hands together kind of thing. No fencing without decent clothes, because we're all very gentle folk, or pretending to be anyway, so you got to look kind of good. No talking or making signs while the master is instructing. Again, I can only imagine what kind of tomfoolery was happening while the master wasn't looking and catching his students kind of goofing off. Respecting the weapons, so no dropping the weapons. Don't lift the sword with your foot. You salute at the entrance. No touching the weapons without permission. A lot of standard, respect these weapons, respect the gear. Because a lot of times these weapons weren't the property of the students. It might be the property of the fencing master. So obviously he wants to protect his investment and stuff. In safety, no passing between weapons on the master and the equipment. So like, again, like, I don't know what we see this in even like people doing pickups and stuff. You pick up with your buddy and someone just oblivious and almost walks past you. I feel like that's what this rule is kind of saying. Like, don't walk between two people free fencing, which it should be a no-brainer, but sometimes we kind of need to spell things out. And even back then. So it's kind of funny to see how little things has kind of changed, or how similar what we do actually is to in period, or slightly out of period, as it were, culture was. All right, so this is Charles Besnard actually describes a salute. So I kind of did an interpretation of this, so we're going to watch this real quick. This is an early interpretation. He doesn't really say how you initially saw off a standing or how smooth this should be. So my version is very kind of staccato-like, as I'm still kind of memorizing all the steps. And it actually was suggested that I try doing this to some period music, just to kind of see if that helps influence how I move with the salutes. So I think the next version might have some cool Baroque kind of music playing in the background. So we'll just kind of watch this real quick. This is the first time I've actually run into any of the manuals I've read actually talks about how to salute, like actually gives a detailed description of what the salute should kind of look at. So there's the doffing of the hat, there's the raising of the sword, there's pulling the foot back. So it has a very dance-like element to it, which I think is part of where the suggestion of putting it to some period music kind of came from. So I'm kind of figuring out how I can adapt this to SCA and HEMA fencing, like instead of the hat, like using my mask and stuff for like a little bit of a period kind of doffing of it in salute and stuff. So I'll just kind of let this go. And there's a link to, at the end of this also, to where you can download Besnard's manual, so people can kind of check it out for themselves as well. The downside about Besnard's manual, it's only half translated at the moment. I did poke the translator, and he says that the full translation is almost done. It's just kind of being copy edited and proofread. So hopefully soonish we'll be able to get a full version of it. All right, so now we're going to move on to how do you become a fencing master. And sometimes they would actually use the phrase, the title maître joueur, or master player. So like a lot of times they use the word play comes a lot, so which is kind of interesting and kind of cool. So the initiation. So we're gonna be jumping around from the 16th and 17th century just to kind of give people an idea that this is kind of like taking little bits and pieces to get an idea of what the overall culture is like, and not necessarily what it was like at this exact year, kind of thing. So in the mid 16th century, if you wanted to study under a fencing master, you had to swear on a cross that you wouldn't use the art for anything bad, like robbery, and you promised to behave honorably for church, king, and master. The student paid a fee at the initiation of training, either a flat fee or half cost, or sometimes it was a weekly sub. So I am almost kind of picturing like a Renaissance version of like Patreon or OnlyFans, but for fencing and stuff. The initiation lasted 4 to 6 weeks. There were two tests that came up in one of my sources. One is called the Passe en Rue. The other one was Passe en Defense. I'm not sure what either of those are. The article wasn't quite sure what the cultural significance of either of these were, other than it was a thing that happened and there was not much more detail. So if anyone has any extra sources on that, that would be super cool. So if you want to become a fencing master, originally you just had to be a provost for 2 years. Not too bad. Then 1585, they upped that to 4 years. And then in 1633, they upped it to 6 years. So like we got this little bit of creep of how long you need to study to become a fencing master. There was no reason, and none of the sources I had kind of gave a reason for that. My only guess is maybe, I mean, I just would be guessing, so I'm not too sure. But it is kind of interesting to see like how long it would take to actually become a fencing master in France. There was a religious test in the 1630s that was added to basically, you had to be Catholic. So even though this was post wars of religion, and Huguenots were recognized as being, for the most part, being okay folks in France, there's still a lot of discrimination kind of going along in there. Even if they're legally recognized, there's still a lot of um, problems and stuff between the two factions, even though if they weren't in open war with each other, really, for the most part. And you also be a native of France. Again, they're trying to weed out Italians from being able to be, and this is in Paris. Other guilds in other cities might have their own rules, but you had to be a native of France if you want to be a fencing master in Paris. 1644, you had to be at least 25 years old to be a fencing master or a new master. If your dad was a fencing master, you got 3 years shaved off, so you could be a fencing master at 22, kind of assuming that you just grew up around swords all that time. So your first 3 years, I guess, is from your newborn and a toddler. You get you a little bit of a bonus. Masters could only take one provost at a time unless another fencing master died, and then they could adopt that master's provost to basically take them on to help them finish off their training, which is kind of cool. It's kind of cool. The exam. So now we're kind of hop into the 1640s. The people want to be fencing master were tested on several things. Single sword, so just the rapier basically, sword and dagger, the halberd, and the baton de boots, so a two-headed baton, which is basically what this image is here on the right. This is only I've only seen this described really in detail by Pasha, who is a German fencing master. But in his intro chapter, he basically is like, yeah, only the French really use this. So I'm assuming that these two things are related. This is me making a connection versus someone who might be much smarter than me being like, yes, this is exactly what it is. But it seems to jive. And he's basically says that this particular form is really good at holding off like up to 15 swordsmen in the open field. So you got to see this is he's really throwing this as a great melee weapon. And I guess it kind of makes sense if you got two iron spikes, so two spears on either end, and swinging this around. We're going to watch a video of a second of me playing around with this particular weapon. But it's very similar to like the Spadone or Martante, so a great sword. So you get this thing moving and you just keep on swinging it. It's really like you're looking at you and your 14 buddies deciding who's going to eat it first. Because sure, we might be fine doing that in melee in the SCA because we're not actually going to die. But like if you've been hired to like run this guy down or whoever he's protecting, he's probably, my guess is he's probably a bodyguard if he's carrying this weapon around. You might be thinking, am I getting paid enough to take that steel spike to the face? Also in 1644, the two-handed sword was added to the examination. Not all these weapons you actually had to fence other masters in. It's unclear if they just needed to study it or if they had to do like an oral presentation or what. But basically, they needed to do single sword and sometimes sword and dagger, and everything else they needed to know about, which again might be part of, in some ways, of of what way of like weeding out Italians who were really focusing, according to one of the books, were really focusing mostly on like sword and dagger and stuff, which isn't super true because Alfieri has a book on fighting with a flag and also fighting with a great sword and stuff. So like, I kind of take that a little bit of a grain of salt. Like I said, the aspirants only battled with foil and sword of dagger. Tests were made public, traditionally held in a tennis court, and tickets were sold. So this was a very public spectacle. I got to see like who the new fencing master was in Paris. Very exciting entertainment. So we'll just watch a little bit of this. So this I've been going through Pasha's hunting spear is basically what it is in German. Again, it's very big swings. There's all these overhead strikes. Um, the way he teaches this, it's very much like lessons where it's solo drills where you basically are doing attacks of 4 different corners and doing footwork, which I kind of interpret to kind of mean like, all right, if this is used against multiple opponents, you need to be able to do this attack and quickly turn and face behind you because the guy behind you might be kind of trying to jump you with their sword and stuff. So I'm doing this very slow because I'm still on the newer side of this. And I really was focusing on slow, smooth kind of flow work. A lot of people do this with like long swords and great swords. I think it's a really cool way of practicing uh, historical martial arts. So I decided to try to adapt that idea to this spear and stuff. And this isn't all the moves that are in the book. This is just the ones I could remember at the time. And I'd imagine that you probably could adapt even some other like quarterstaff kind of work into this and stuff as well. So really cool. I'm not going to be able to do this in the SCA based on current rules, at least not the big swings and stuff. But I think it does make for some fun A&S kind of stuff. And these videos are both on my YouTube, which I'll have a link to in case people want to be able to watch it more in depth. I think I have them as unlisted, so I can also drop the links to like the direct link and stuff as well. So if we look at the fencing exam, it was in quotes, a light test against 6 masters. And I just like the idea that like, yes, you were fencing 6 fencing masters and they're calling it a light test. I'm not sure if that means that the fencing masters, like this was mostly for show kind of thing, or if it was kind of tongue in cheek, because I can't imagine that fighting 6 fencing masters is considered light and easy unless it was just more of a formality kind of thing. The aspirants typically didn't know the day or location. They basically were like, hey, I'm ready for this exam. They drop down the money, and then their buddies would kind of like pick them up like the night before. So it almost felt kind of, when I was reading through, it almost felt kind of like bachelor party-esque. It's like, well, let's go get Jean. His test is tomorrow. Let's go bring him to the tavern and just like put him in a room so he can't run off or whatever. But they basically, like, it was a best of 3 against these 6 masters. Double hits did not count, which again, fun to kind of tie that back into what we do with the SCA. If the aspirant or the person who is basically testing for their mastery loses cleanly to the first 2 masters, they get basically sent back to school to practice some more. Which I can see like someone being very extremely nervous about their first time doing this test and kind of like screwing it up a little bit, and come back in like 6 months or whatever. After the examination, if he was judged capable by the community, so basically by his peers in the, I was about to say the order, in the guild, the aspirant swears an oath before the Monsieur and the King's Procure. Decisions were made within 24 hours. So it was basically a little bit of a polling order in kind of some ways. You had it like, you did your test and then they decided if they thought you were good enough to join their guild. And there were the exams and the prize fights were separate. So the exams were like super serious, kind of, at least this is what it seems like. It seems like the exams were kind of super serious. Trying to like test to like pass this thing. And the prize fight was kind of more like a celebrational kind of thing. So the prize fights, this is what the prizes were. So in 1630s, first place got a silver sword. Second place got a gold ring. Third place got deerskin gloves. Fourth place got dozen sashes of blended silver and silk. So next time I do a tournament in the SCA, I expect to see all these lovely prizes. Can you imagine winning a silver sword at like an SCA tournament or something? That would be unreal. In the 40s, this kind of changes a little bit. And again, this might also vary from like location. I'm not sure if these were like, this is what the culture was like at this time, or if this just happens to be what someone found as a record. So there could have been other ways of doing this, just as a heads up. I don't want to say like, this is how they all look like at a given year. But prizes in the 40s, a sword, whoever hits closest to the heart in the single sword prize fight, and a sword, whoever hit closest to the heart in the sword and dagger, and the winner of the single sword couldn't win also sword and dagger. They could still compete, but like you only win one prize. Which again, I know this comes up in the SCA in terms of like, hey, this person won, especially like the by the book tourney when there might be like a tournament winner, but also a winner for who fought most accurately to their given style. If you're looking for a historical excuse to give more prizes out to different people, just say you're being very French and that you can't win multiple prizes. You can just blame it on the French, I think is basically what this comes down to. Also, the aspirants gave a pair of gloves to their master. The one reason I heard for this is the idea is like they've trained you so much, they've worn through their own gloves. So, hey, boss, thanks for teaching me for the past 2 to 6 years. Here's a new pair of gloves. And if the aspirant won one of their prizes in the prize fights, they traditionally would also give that to their fencing master. And like I was mentioning, these tests and exams usually were on French tennis courts. So this is an illustration of what those kind of courts look like. If anyone has watched the 1970s version of the Three Musketeers with Richard Lester, there's a scene where they're playing tennis, which is a pretty good representation of kind of what that looks like and stuff too. Jeu de paume, palm ball basically is kind of like what it translates to. All right, so now we're getting to the fun bit of this is the dueling culture. So did the French actually fight and kill each other as much as history says in terms of the reputation? And it seems so. So first of all, these figures, I want like statistics and like stat keeping back then wasn't exact science. So take these figures with a grain of salt, but at least it kind of gives you an idea of at least how they saw things and stuff. So in the early 17th century, 350 duelists were brought to the attention of the authorities of Henry IV. So Henry IV was assassinated in 1610. So just to kind of give you a rough estimate of what we mean by early 17th century, and almost another 350 were killed because it's easy to kind of hide maybe if you were the winner, a little bit harder to hide the dead bodies. So like we're looking at least 350 dead in duels just in Paris, the Paris area in that early 10 years. Again, take that number with a grain of salt. That's still a lot of bodies dropping in duels. From 1643 to 1654, the Duc de Gramont says the duels cost the lives of 940 gentlemen. He doesn't say where those numbers came from. So again, grain of salt. But basically, in 11 years, he had 940 people dying from duels. So, and that's just again, this is just in like well, Gramont might be a little bit outside of Paris. I forget exactly where he was saying his numbers are coming from, but we're still looking at a lot of bodies dropping. We can see based on like the rough estimates and such, kind of like the trends of how popular duels were. Duels really peaked during peacetime and kind of dropped during times of war, which kind of makes sense. If you're at war, there's less time to kill your buddy. You're busy trying to kill Spaniards or whoever you were fighting against that day in the 30 Years' War. But during peacetime, especially if most of your life has been soldiering and fighting and such, you might be looking to someone to start a fight with. So it's kind of interesting, and it makes sense to me that we'd see more duels during peacetime than during war. The French dueling culture is also very different than how like the Italians and Spanish and the English and the Holy Roman Empire were kind of doing things. I don't get into that, but I'll show people the book that kind of really goes in good detail, kind of detail the differences between all the different cultures and stuff, because it's really interesting. The culture of the French dueling culture, kind of changed over time as well. So in the medieval times, it was very formal. It was really it was the king or a royal, some of the part of the royal household or noble would basically lend you a field and would watch over the fight. So this is the fighting to like see who was right. God will help me. I'm the right, so I will win because God's on my side, kind of thing. So those were public spectacles. You had to like ask permission to use a field. They were usually like a kind of a rectangle, boxed in or fenced in piece of land that varied in sizes. There were heralds, so it's almost like crown tourneys for the SCA, but to fight to the death or to fight to see who was right or wrong about whatever legal proceeding that they were kind of arguing about and stuff like that. Um, in the post 1550s, the duel became more of a private affair. The Kane and royal households weren't really given lending out, at least officially, people to uh, permission, I should say, to use their lands for fights and stuff. But there was still exchanging of cartels, which were written agreements. Some of these were short, some of them were long manifestos. It usually was, you know, blah 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 is a jerk. I saw them doing this. They were a big dirty liar. The other person being like, nope, screw that. He's lying. I didn't do any of those things. And they kind of fight. So they were basically exchanging of why they're fighting each other. And some of them would be very short. Some of them, they really kind of wrote super long stuff. And then when we get into the 17th century, the cartels kind of fell out of fashion. So people now weren't doing written agreements. They were basically just doing this orally. So we really come a long way from this big presentation where it was a big spectacle. There was heralds. There was a long time between the challenge and the actual fight because there was like a whole long day affair that needed to like set it up, kind of like our crown tourney, to basically, you want to go? You want to go? Cool. Let's go out back and kind of fight each other. So the time between fights really kind of shortened within 100 years. So now the denial of accusation, the appointment, the choice of weapons were all exchanged orally, and sometimes this was in minutes. So before there might be months that would go by before the duels. Now we're talking about just like grab your weapon, I'll meet you out back kind of thing. And these duels were typically called encounters, but for accuracy's sake, we're still calling these duels, even if they weren't like, I'll meet you in a week to fight. You know, it's the same thing, but it was kind of interesting that they had a specific term for it. When and where duels happened. So pretty much wherever, if you were very bold, or you wanted people to see you, or you had a quote strong taste for the spectacular, you would pick a very public place for people to see, like the center of town or in the city, a public square, because you want everyone to see how grand you are and how fantastic you're gonna win this duel. If you were looking to maybe not be caught by the religious civil authorities, which is perfectly legit, you might try to go place a little bit more secluded, like in a shade woods and forests. There were definitely like very popular places where fights would happen. French gentlemen in Marie de Medici's court, after she was kind of exiled, would duel in the quote, the usual meeting place for the duels of this court. So these guys were dueling enough that there was basically their popular haunt for where they would just do all these fighting in. So you just be like, yeah, just meet us in the usual place where we always fight this stuff, which is kind of amusing. Uh, the early duels were usually fought during the day, especially if it was like that grand, like the early duels for uh, the grand spectacles. They would stop it as the sun kind of like set. But when it became more like the encounters, where like we're just going to throw down right away, those could be in the evening or even at night, called moonlight duels. They happened, but they were pretty rare. I think most people don't really want to fight in the dark. Any of us that have fought as the sun was setting outside realizes how difficult that can be with masks on. And I feel like the mask kind of gives you extra shade, so you can kind of get an idea of just how difficult that might be at night and stuff like. In terms of who you could challenge only someone if they were of an age and health allowed. So there's a lot of stretchiness in this qualification. So like if a young kid kind of was the person challenging you, you could accept. You wouldn't challenge some rickety old person who could like walking around on a cane. and duels were usually fought by equals. So there were like stories in which like a soldier and a nobleman were fighting it or having like arguments over a woman, but they couldn't duel because of their stature wouldn't allow them to until the soldier kind of ranked up high enough that they were considered equals on some footing, and then they actually would throw down. But they had multiple run-ins. Again, that's one of the stories in one of the books that I'll show at the end and stuff. They had multiple run-ins in which like the lower class dude got beat down by like the guy's servants or whatever, until he was able to actually fight an actual duel. So we can look at some reasons for duels, and I feel like nothing on here really is super surprising. So one of the books I was looking at, kind of these are the reported cases they found between 1560 and 1659. So a pretty big stretch. Over women were 24 cases, and this is not like if I win, I get her kind of thing. It's more like we both wanted to marry her. Her dad says you can marry her. I don't like this, so I'm gonna fight you over it or whatever. But if I win, it's not like she is a prize or anything like that. It was more like I'm jealous that I didn't get picked and you did, so let's throw down. Rival factions. So this really kind of plays into that like Three Musketeer and Cardinal's Guard kind of thing. Not necessarily that's what those cases are, but basically you have like two different groups throwing it down. Over public office, again, this is similar to like over women. It's not like if I beat you, I get your job. It's more like you got the job, and I don't like that, so we're gonna duke it out. But if I win, it's not necessarily that I'm gonna like I get to step into your place or anything like that. Family inheritance. With this money, especially a lot of money to be had, there's going to be some jealousy and fighting. So you would see people fighting over, especially like legal proceedings and family inheritance, and rivalry over precedence and honorific distinctions and stuff. Which is, I feel like that is peak SCA kind of right there with some of the debates over who sits where kind of thing and all that kind of stuff. This is another cool quote. Duels are fought by those seeking to marry, to gain homages because of legal trials, to win precedence in church and public assemblies, in fact, for all sorts of quarrels. So you really could fight over anything. These were just the reasons they found. And again, when we get to the 17th century, where these exchanges were done orally, there's no written document about what they fought over. So it could have been any of these things or anything else. The worst thing that you could be called though was a liar. But there's a distinction between that is untrue versus you are a liar. So if I, said Lissa did this thing, if she didn't want to fight me and just like kind of clear the record, she would say that is untrue. That's not true. It didn't happen. If she really took offense to this and she wanted me to throw down with me, she would say you are a liar. So basically, the difference is one's kind of like correcting the record, the other one is attacking my honor, and now we need to draw swords and kind of duke it out. This is one of the last quote that I really like as a letter of challenge. This is a good burn. But Monsieur, you are such a little thing that were it not for the insolence of your words, I would never have remembered you. So this is one of those cartels, one of those like kind of like written challenges or written agreements. Again, some of them wrote long. This guy, Lord Castel Bayard, he really got to the point and kind of really drove in that proverbial dagger or metaphorical dagger before swords were drawn. So that was really cool. I kind of really just like that one. And that's it. So here are my sources. So just so when I send out this link in a second in the chat, so people kind of have an idea. This is a great resource. This one talks about French fencing, archives of the French fence. Oh, actually, this is supposed to be these. So I got to fix this. These two sources are kind of got mixed and matched in terms of in my bibliography. Sorry about that. But Henry Darcy, he has a collection of all these records, the Master of Arms of Paris. This is where we kind of get like what the laws were for the guilds and how it changed over time. That's where we have some records of like that last quote. So that last challenge was from there. So like, especially I think it's a really great resource, especially if you write words for scrolls, because there's like letters patents in there, so you can kind of see, get some good ideas and stuff for scroll work. This article by Oliver Dupuy, again, I gotta fix this, really talks about like French fencing rules in like outside of Paris, kind of like the northeast portion of France, which is kind of cool. Thomas Harmon, known as Master Philip of the Mid-Realm, he did recently a video on fighting in the French style. He kind of went through like medieval all the way through early 17th century. So he did a blog post and he recorded a video. So he really talks about the French fencing masters in more detail, and also the Italian masters who were operating in France or had books translated in French and stuff. So that's a really good resource if you want to kind of have a little more of an expanded look at what was kind of being influential in French fencing culture in terms of book form in those days. Maître Ciso Longino, he's a classically trained French fencing master through the Martinez School. I believe he went through the Martinez School. He recently did a series of a brief history of French school. So through the Renaissance, all the way through like more I forget where he ended, but it was maybe like 19th century French fencing. So he's got like 3 different videos. He kind of shows he talks a lot about how the weapons changed. So if you're interested in how like the rapier got to the small sword, he talks a lot about that. And then you can get some of the French fencing master translations from Renaissance Sword Club. So this link will bring you some PDFs, which has been really good for reading. And let me just kind of unshare the screen so I can show a couple of the books. 1 second. So this is the book that if you're interested in comparing the French fencing culture to like the Spanish, the English, and the Italians and stuff, this is really good. This can be a little bit difficult to find. It kind of comes in and out. I found this on Amazon, but it took months to be able to find it. I know Wick found it, so maybe he has a secret source, so if you get it off Amazon as well.
It was Amazon and it was quick.
Okay, cool. So yeah, it kind of comes and goes, but like it's thick, and it talks about like medieval French fencing, dueling culture all the way through like the mid 17th century. So you really can see how things kind of evolved in their tradition. This is the archives of the Master of Arms of Paris. So this has like where like the pattern of arms are, and like it has a list of who the Parisian masters were operating during different years, which is kind of cool. So if you're looking for a French name, you can kind of pull some names out of here. It's a good source for you. And if you're kind of looking for see how the Italian and French schools split, because again, we're talking about how the French were very influenced by the Italians, and then they kind of had their own. The history of fencing by Gallagher is really good. It's really light on Renaissance fencing. It's more like small sword all the way through the 19th century, but it is kind of cool to kind of see how things kind of like were similar and kind of branched out, especially over the years and stuff. So those are other really good books to kind of look at. And I will share. So that's a link to my slides in case folks want to relook at this later and watch the videos and all that stuff. So I am open to questions if anyone has any.
There were some in the chat. I don't know if you can
find. Yeah, I can scroll to the beginning. Let's see. Let's see. Bella asks, I'm curious if Ferrieres was a slam on Italian swords, a reference to Porte de Ferro guards, or both. I'm unsure. I think it just could be that both words mean like similar to iron, right? Because isn't Porte de Ferro like Iron Gate or something like that? Or I haven't done much Bolognese to know if my Italian's good on that one. Yeah, the document that I looked at didn't say where exactly they came from, other than it was basically slang for people who weren't allowed to be teaching. So it was kind of a diminutive word. Let's see what else here. Yeah, heavy 46-inch blade. Yeah, it was a big chunker foil. I suppose if you're practicing with something that heavy, if you pick up your regular rapier, it's almost kind of like baseball plays with like the weights on the bat, and then you take off the donut and nice and light. But again, I don't know if that's why they was like that, or if that just happened to be how that one worked. Lissa, you asked, is given receiving language mirrored in other countries? I'm unsure. I haven't really dove. I don't think this book talks about that at all, and I haven't really dove into the other cultures to kind of see and stuff. That's a interesting idea, or at least an avenue to kind of dive down. Let's see. Yeah, so Cassandra asks, I wonder if you're intended to conceal the inside of the crown of the hat for politeness. So I think if I remember correctly, when I went back and was reading through the description, I think it actually says to show the inside of the hat when doing that salute. Yes, I'm not sure. Yeah, I felt like I also read someplace else that like doing that is considered impolite. So I'm not sure if it could be the translation was maybe not accurate, or it could be, I don't know, it could be something else. I'm not sure. But that is interesting. I did kind of notice that there is that was a little bit different than what I've read in other places. Yeah, Theron kind of was mentioning that showing the insight you have was considered insulting. I don't know the cost of students charge. I did run into what some of the fencing Italian masters were making. I don't remember the numbers off that at the top of my head, but I haven't found that for what it was like in France. I know for like the Italians, it was not a lot at all, but a lot of them were teaching other things. They were like teachers at universities and stuff, so they might be teaching math or science. I don't know if that's also true in France, or if they were just full-time fencing masters. None of my sources kind of really mentioned what they were doing for a living beyond that, so I don't know. Yeah, there is a lot that I do not know, just as a heads up. But these are all great questions. How do they sell tickets if the day location is not known? So the person who was going to be tested didn't know, but everyone else knew. So like they would, like the book didn't say like how that information was passed around, but I assume it might be similar to like what they were doing in London, where they might kind of like tell people or plaster things up like maybe the night before or whatever. So yeah, it didn't really say, but I assume that like word got around pretty fast despite the lack of Facebook and email. Yeah, Bill kind of making the comparison, or like SAA awards, the person doesn't know they get in it, but everyone else does. Yeah, it could be exactly similar to that. Awesome. Oh, cool. So I just want to like read this comment out because the people won't be able to see this watching the recording. But Tara wrote, meant to add a comment earlier in the presentation when it was being discussed. Conversely, to Italian fencing masters' influence in France, there is also evidence of French fencing masters' growing influence in Italy and England. In this period, evidence of this even appears in Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. Yeah, like when we get to some of the especially in the close to the 1640s, some of the English playwrights were more quoting French terminology. So yeah, by the 1640s, the English were definitely looking more at the French schools and stuff more than the Italian schools. And also like around this by Louis XIV, or I think actually Louis XIII said basically was spouting like how great the French fencing masters finally became, that everyone was asking for French masters and not Italians. I don't know if that's true, or if that's just Louis XIII just hyping up his own guys because he's the king and he's supposed to hype out his people and stuff. I think we would need to find records in other countries of like French masters actually, I think, being employed in other families, households, or in other cities to know for sure how widespread that is by Louis XIII. But definitely by the 40s, which is basically the end of Louis XIII. He died in 1642 or 43. So Louis XIV he wasn't king for a little while. He was still a king at that time. But around that kind of area, we're definitely seeing a lot of influence of the French terminology in England, at least. Yeah. Awesome. That's caught up on all the questions, unless anyone has any other ones that kind of pop to mind. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming out and listening to me ramble on. Like I said, there is, especially like this book, there's just so much in here that like we just couldn't get in today, and I just couldn't remember to even espouse on the fly and stuff. But it was one of those things that it was kind of cool running down that rabbit hole and finding all these other sources and kind of getting a picture of what like my persona in the SCA as a fencing as a mod in the East Kingdom kind of might have would have gone through to kind of get to that particular place and how we would have been fighting. And fortunately for me, I can just fight Italian and call it a day. But it is fun to kind of read the French books and kind of like also see like what the what life was like in the fencing schools and stuff like that, and just how similar it is to what like our practices are sometimes like and what some human practices are like and stuff. So the more things change, the more they stay the same, I suppose. But if anyone has any questions, just like you can poke me. Again, like at the end of the slides has like where you can find me on social media if we're not already if we're not friends on Facebook, my blog and the YouTube and all that stuff. So I'll hit the end of recording, and thanks everybody.